I think the superpower of an in-house researcher is the ability to work very closely with their internal partners and stakeholders to make sure that the right message lands on the right ears at the right moment, and to be there for that long period of time so that you're part of those conversations when, boom, this is the moment when we need those insights. This is the document. This is the meeting, which is very different than a vendor just handing over a report and an invoice and, moving on to the next thing. And then we recognized that the best way to build buy-in was to bring those skeptics along in the process. And at the time, Spotify was in an office in Stockholm, so it was open. And the beauty of that was product managers, designers, data people, leaders. At one point, the Prince of Stockholm came walking through. Katy Perry walked through in this fabulous jacket. If you are able to walk into that room and go, what in the world are all these stickies? And we're able to do a wall walk with you, say, oh, come see what we're working on. This is for the personas that we're creating. Here's a whole theme over here related to how people discovered Spotify, or why they use Spotify instead of Apple Music, or how they decide if they're going to pay for premium or not, and let people see all the data that we're analyzing as we're considering what these personas might be. It built credibility. Like, we're not making these up. These are actually grounded in jobs to be done and really solid qualitative research analysis. That built so much buy-in for the personas. So early VR research was quite challenging, and I thought it would be fun to focus on that. What I never expected was that when I got in-house at Meta, I was going to love being in-house. And that was because I got really hooked on.
Our guest today is highly experienced CX UX researcher, having worked at a Meta and as a consultant for the likes of Spotify, Lyft, and The Gap. Please welcome Julie. Hi, Julie. How are you?
Hi, good. Thank you so much for having me, Vaughn.
Hey, look, real pleasure. Thanks for making time. Perhaps you can share a little bit about how that came about, but also a bit more of your background.
Oh, I'd be happy to. So yes, Nick Bomast has become a friend and is a person who I work with a lot. And he and I actually met through a Google group. There's a group here founded in the San Francisco Bay Area. It's called the Google Design User Research Group. And it was started by a couple of researchers, Anne Laviglio and Rachel Wong, back in the day when there were so few UX researchers in the San Francisco Bay Area that we could meet in people's living rooms. And that's funny to me because that Google group now has more than 7,000 UX researchers worldwide in it. It's a huge group, but Nick would occasionally post about journey mapping. And so when I was first getting involved in journey mapping, I reached out to him and said, I have a client who wants to do a journey map, and you know more about this than I do. Can we partner on this? That was the first time Nick and I partnered together. And when you're a researcher and you're sharing field work, you spend a lot of time together. So Nick and I were traveling together, sharing meals together, listening to really loud music together, and we became friends. And also we have partnered on so many projects together. When I was at Meta, I was in Meta Reality Labs and brought him in a couple times to do journey mapping with me. And we've continued, since I left Meta, we've continued to partner together on work.
Brilliant. Yeah, I was certainly significantly influenced early in my sort of discovery, I suppose, of design thinking, and Nick's processes is something that I go back on all the time. And obviously his book there, I refresh myself on that every time I have a new project. There we go. It's a small world, right?
Yes, very small world. And you'd also ask me about my background. So I've been in research longer than I care to admit. I actually started my career in market research. And in fact, I was a quant jock. So I started as a quantitative researcher. And then something really funny happened when I gave birth to my first kid. It was like this switch flipped in my brain. And two things happened. One, for the first time in my life, I liked chocolate. It was like totally bizarre. And then the other thing that happened is I was like, I don't want to do quantitative research anymore. Now I want to focus on qualitative research. I've been kind of a mixed methods researcher earlier in my career, but after the birth of my first child, I was like, I don't want to do quant research anymore. So I made the switch to qualitative research. Shortly after that, I really started focusing on UX research. And of course, back in the day, early in my career, I was doing primarily usability testing. I always had a fairly holistic strategic lens on the usability testing that I was doing. I think that's one thing that my approach has always been a little bit different. I try to take a kind of a giant step back and not get too narrowly focused and too task-oriented in my usability testing, because I want to see what we can learn about the product space anytime I'm doing that type of work. But over the last 15 years, most of my client work has been in three things: persona development, jobs to be done, and journey mapping. And most of it is persona development and journey mapping. And as you mentioned earlier, I did go in-house at Meta kind of unexpectedly because I had an opportunity to work in virtual reality. And I thought it would be really fun to work on nascent technology. I was one of the first researchers focused on virtual reality, and to work in a space where there's no best practices to emulate was really exciting. It was a really exciting space to be working in. And also just to do research with a whole new interaction model where you're interviewing somebody and you can't see what they're doing in their headset, right? So early VR research was quite challenging, and I thought it would be fun to focus on that. What I never expected was that when I got in-house at Meta, I was going to love being in-house. And that was because I got really hooked on being able to see the impact of my work. And that's one thing that as a consultant, we don't have as much influence over that. My 5 years in-house at Meta has really changed how I work with my clients. So I was a consultant for a long time, went in-house at Meta. Now I'm back out doing independent research consulting again.
Full circle, yeah.
Yeah.
Brilliant. Well, let's just maybe dive in a little bit around perhaps your time at Meta. How has that time now influenced you as a UX researcher now that you're out as a consultant again?
Yeah, I'm so glad you asked that. I was just talking to the person who brought me into Meta last week, in fact, and we were reflecting. Both of us have spent time consulting and also being in-house, and we were reflecting on how different it is and the learning curve. And I think as a consultant, the client's always right. So client needs something, you got to deliver it. You got to deliver it, within their budget, on their schedule. And so you end up, when the client snaps their fingers, you jump. And it was such a major mind shift for me to be in-house and realize that I was no longer sprinting. I had to run marathons. And I was in my early days as an in-house researcher, whenever one of my product partners, whether it was an engineer or a product manager or designer, expressed a need for insights about something, my orientation was, yes, I'll do that for you. And I ended up saying yes to everything. And the volume of work that I was carrying was just crippling. And so I finally realized, being an in-house researcher is different. I don't take orders. This is not client service. This is me being a partner to you. And we together have to figure out what are the trade-offs we're going to make because I can't do everything. So that was a challenge of learning how to be an in-house researcher. And of course, it becomes clear to you once you've left. But once I left Meta, I realized I'm a better consultant having spent those 5 years in-house because I have a much better understanding of how research fits into the product development cycle, what the designers need, what the product managers need, what the engineers need, what leadership needs to inform strategy, prioritization, and so forth. And one of the main things I've recognized is so often as vendors, we're asked to do a body of work and hand over the results. And when you have a vendor do that work for you, you never know the insights as well as if you do that work yourself. And so what it taught me is at every opportunity, when you're working with a vendor, whether you are the vendor or you're the client, do that as collaboratively as possible so that, for example, you're sharing the interviews, you're sharing the analysis, you were sharing the production of the final deliverables. And what you can do as the in-house researcher is focus as much as possible on that collaboration piece because the vendor can't do that. And that's something that you as the internal researcher, that's a superpower that you have. And that's where you're far more likely to have impact from your research. If you bring your stakeholders and your partners along on the entire journey of landing to those insights, they're far more likely to be accepted, acted upon, and integrated into the decisions they need to be supporting, as opposed to just handing over a final deliverable that's like a, report, which you hope people are going to read, or a giant journey map, which you hope people are going to look at someday. I think the superpower of an in-house researcher is the ability to work very closely with their internal partners and stakeholders to make sure that the right message lands on the right ears at the right moment. And to be there for that long period of time so that you're part of those conversations when, boom, this is the moment when we need those insights. This is the document. This is the meeting, which is very different than a vendor just handing over a report and an invoice and, moving on to the next thing.
Yeah, I love that. And I sort of picked up on the word marathon as well before. So perhaps in relation or linking with what you're talking about, this collaboration and bringing other people on that journey, how do you sort of balance I suppose the words that I often use is meeting them where they're at. So how do you go about finding out the sort of level and way that you might best go about bringing them on that journey?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think stakeholder interviews are incredibly important, whether you are a vendor or an in-house researcher. So if you're an in-house researcher, hopefully you have standing meetings with some of your partners. So you've got your product team, you've got your designers, you've got your leaders, and hopefully there's a regular cadence of check-ins that you're doing with them. So you always have a sense of what's on their mind, what they're grappling with. For example, are there strategic decisions that leadership is struggling to make because they feel like there's a fork in the road and they got to make this call or that call? And can you, because they're grappling with that decision, start tailoring your research to give you insights you need to support that, or triangulating research you've done in the past to help support that decision? But as a vendor, I think so often there's an instinct to, ship things really quickly and skipping that phase of understanding what the internally held beliefs are, what the questions are, where there's stress or anxiety about decisions that are being made, what are the assumptions people don't even realize they're making. And before I joined Meta, actually, I did a really interesting consulting project with Spotify. And Spotify's UX research team at the time was fairly new, and they were beginning to shift into doing more foundational research. They had design partners who were asking for a set of personas. That's really the best place to be, is to have your internal partners asking you for personas, jobs to be done, or journey maps, because you don't want to be trying to push people to want jobs to be done. If they're asking you for jobs to be done, then there's some kind of an appetite that's been built, and they're far more likely to accept this body of foundational research if there's already existing appetite for it. You can build that as an internal researcher, but wow, when they come to you and say, we need foundational research, you're in a really good position to partner with them. So Spotify had this new-ish research team. They were trying to move away from doing, evaluative usability testing to doing more foundational research. And fortunately, we recognized that building buy-in was going to be very important. So they had design partners who were asking for a set of personas, and they had a lot of skepticism internally. And so by building time for stakeholder interviews and a kickoff into the project schedule, we were able to start developing relationships and rapport, and in fact, invite skepticism. So one of the things I always tell people is I didn't believe in personas for most of my career. Like, I would have nothing to do with personas. I felt like they were a shortcut to avoid doing important research. There's a lot of personas that are not actually well grounded in research, and they're kind of garbage. And I think they've given personas a bad name. And so when I tell people who are skeptical about personas that I understand that skepticism, that I had the same thing. And it was only when I did some personas for Walmart.com and I saw, by the way, they dragged me to that kicking and screaming. I didn't want to create a set of personas for them because I didn't believe in them, but they were like, please, we really need your help to create the set of personas. So as I mentioned with Nick Bomas, I brought in a partner who knows a lot about personas. Yeah. They helped me create my first set of personas. And I ended up creating many, many sets of personas for Walmart.com over the years.
Yeah. So what was it that Walmart were originally sort of struggling with that led them to bring you in on the personas?
Yeah, I was going to tell you that. What I was going to tell you is that, so I'd spent most of my career not wanting anything to do with personas. I changed my tune when I saw how beneficial that set of personas was for the product and design team at Walmart. And again, I created 4 sets of personas for them over the years: Sam's Club, Walmart.com, a Walmart online grocery, really, really fun work. And so when I started that work at Spotify, I was able to tell people, I get it. I understand that you're skeptical. You're more comfortable with A/B testing. You're a data person. You put more faith in quantitative research. I understand you're a little skeptical of how these personas are going to work. And so to allow people to be honest, instead of just being in a quietly defensive place of like, they've hired this consultant named Julie to create this set of personas and I'm not going to buy it, right? We established rapport very early. And then we recognized that the best way to build buy-in was to bring those skeptics along in the process. And at the time, Spotify was in an office in Stockholm that was this really weird building. It was almost like cone-shaped. It's weird glass building with a circular atrium in the middle. It was like a giant V-shaped donut. And I think our war room was on the 5th floor. And when you walked out of the elevators, you were in this design studio, which they made our war room. So it was open. And the beauty of that was product managers, designers, data people, leaders. At one point, the Prince of Stockholm came walking through. Katy Perry walked through in this fabulous jacket once. If you are able to walk into that war room and go, what in the world are all these stickies? And we're able to do a wall walk with you, say, come see what we're working on. This is for the personas that we're creating. Here's a whole theme over here related to how people, discovered Spotify, or why they use Spotify instead of Apple Music, or how they decide if they're going to pay for premium or not, and let people see all the data that we're analyzing as we're considering what these personas might be. It built credibility. Like, we're not making these up. These are actually grounded in jobs to be done and really solid qualitative research analysis. That built so much buy-in for the personas. The other thing that we did was, we're sort of landing. We think these are going to be the 4 or 5 personas based on what the research says, but they're only valuable if they're useful to the business. And so we'd go to the business early and say, hey, key stakeholders from product, from design, from engineering, from leadership teams, this is where we think we're heading. Do these personas feel like they're useful to you? And there was one that we were really unsure about, and they were able to say, actually, that's very useful to this business to understand this kind of person. Please continue developing that persona. It was true to the data, right? People often think that quant segmentation is like, well, this is real data. This is statistics that made these, and qualitative is squishy. There's actually judgment calls to be made when you're using quant for segmentation. And so, people like to think, well, there's 5 segments. Of course, there's 5 segments. No, there's 5 segments because that's what you told the statistics to do, right? You looked at a 4-segment solution, a 5-segment solution, a 6-segment, and you chose that the 5-segment solution made the most sense. With the Cooper approach to persona analysis, which is what I use from Alan Cooper, you also have the ability to say, we see a cluster here, we see a cluster here, we could see a cluster here, or we could fold them over here. And so anyway, bringing those stakeholders along for that journey of saying, is this going to be useful to the business? How can we make this more useful to the business? Builds buy-in so that by the time those personas land, you've got appetite for them. People have already been primed to think about, oh, this is interesting. This could help me in my work in this way. You're building appetite, and they're far more likely to accept it and use them when you've brought them along on that whole journey.
Absolutely love that. I recall probably more by accident than sort of an intent. But the first time I started using design thinking in a project was the end of my MBA, and that was in the social services sector. And I'm very visual as it happens, so I put the whole project on, basically physically up on walls. And this it was able to lead people through all the data and how we were sort of thinking about personas and the customer journey and all that. And you get to the end and it's self-evident. And while there might be some discussion and sort of new points of view to add, and that's all super valuable, the data sort of speaks for itself. So I fully agree around the power of bringing people on, sharing things and bringing them on that journey, allowing that sort of input and that extra richness to build up the insights that come out of it all. Yeah.
We've changed the way we work. So these days, I'm generally doing that analysis with digital stickies and a tool like Mural or Miro, or I don't really use FigJam, but you could use FigJam. And I miss those days of those rooms of, colorful stickies everywhere. When I was doing work for Walmart, one of our war rooms was up in like the 4th or 5th floor of a building, and it just wasn't big enough for us. We did 32 in-home interviews plus a diary study. And so we had just massive volumes of data, 32 different colored sticky notes. I mean, it was just crazy how many colors of stickies you can get your hands on. And when you looked from the parking lot up at the building, we'd covered every window with paper, and they had stickies, and the room was glowing. Parking lot like a bowl full of jelly beans. It was really funny. And the room wasn't big enough, so we started bleeding out into the hallway. And the beauty of that is that anybody who was working on that floor in Walmart could wander over and say, what are you guys doing? And get pulled into the real stories of the customers that they're solving for. And so, what that looks like is, this color sticky note is for this, mom of 4 kids who's struggling financially. And, here's how they think about, shopping. And you could follow that color sticky all over the place to understand this person. Or you could look at all the things related to using this coupon app, because we clustered them all together. And it just brings these people to life. So if you're not able to be in the field and attend all these interviews, you can do a wall walk through all of our stickies and kind of pull out some of these stories. And I miss that with these remote collaboration tools, these whiteboarding tools, which are great. I mean, when I'm working with Nick Bomast in New Zealand, sometimes we're together in the same room. Often we're not. And so these remote tools are incredibly helpful.
Absolutely.
I'm not intending to slam these tools. It's just that I do miss the war rooms with all this stuff, all over the.
Absolutely. Just to sort of dive in a little bit more around the Spotify journey map or personas piece. So with those personas, if I heard you correctly, very much grounded in research that they're super powerful when you do that. And then in the piece of bringing people on that journey, so the other domains within the business that need to sort of leverage off these personas, just in the middle piece, like how are you going about validating that these personas are accurate? Are we going back with users and testing it? Or how
That
do you
is
go
a
about
really, really great question. And just to be clear, I can talk about the Spotify personas because they talked about them publicly. So much of the work that I do, I can't talk about in any detail. But if you Google Spotify listener personas, you'll see those personas. And their names are Nick, Olivia, Shelley, Travis, and Cameron. And so there are blogs from Spotify Design from 2017-18, I think, where they give you a peek at those personas and they talk about the process of creating them. They also talked about them in podcasts. They were on the conference circuit. So if you're interested in learning more about those personas, they are out there. And they used those personas actually for innovation until last year. I think there's new research leadership over there at Spotify, and they're not using them as much anymore, but they were really accepted and acted on, which is very exciting. My approach to validating personas has changed over the years. So I mentioned I started my career in quant research, so I've run a fair number of quant segmentations, and I have experimented with running a quant segmentation first. I've experimented with doing the qualitative research. I mean, always we do qualitative research first. Let me back up. Start with the qual research, figure out what the inputs are for the quant. I have tried using the quant segmentation to then say, okay, here's the 5 segments. We're going to make 5 personas. I have found that quant segmentation is not as nuanced as qualitative segmentation or personas using the Cooper methodology. So I've also tried creating the personas and then saying, do these line up? Now that we know those, let's do the quant segmentation. Can we make them line up? And it just never quite worked very well. And I realized, sure, why I'm trying to shove together the Cooper persona methodology with a quant segmentation methodology. And here's the thing, quant segmentation relies on people's perceptions of themselves. And what we do in qualitative research is we observe people. And sometimes what we hear people say about themselves and what we see, there can be a real disconnect. So I remember one example where I was interviewing somebody who was really into couponing. She was obsessed. I mean, she spent so much time cutting coupons. And she talked about her couponing as a way to make ends meet. Well, I was at her house in Palo Alto, California, the heart of Silicon Valley. She had a brand new convertible Porsche in her garage next to brand new matching Harley Davidsons. Making ends meet for her might have been staying in a nicer hotel when she and her family went to Europe for the summer. Right? Literally, they do that. I also, for the same project, interviewed people who were couponing and telling me they were doing it to make ends meet, and they were struggling with whether they could afford to have a birthday party for their child because they were truly struggling to make ends meet. And what I saw in this particular study, because I had the ability to actually ran both of them through my quant survey, I could see that they answered some questions very similarly, and they were such different people. And so I began to really question, am I doing the right thing by trying to use a quant segmentation? Even if I pull behavioral data into it, which is another imperfect data point, right? That's where triangulation of all these things comes together. Any one of these on their own, I would say, is probably not enough. So I have a new way that I like to quantify my personas, and it's basically using the opportunity sizing for jobs to be done. So I just measure, how important is this to you? It's jobs to be done. How important is this jobs to be done for you? How well are we doing meeting the needs of this jobs to be done? And I'm sizing those jobs to be done for different groups of people. And that's really what we care about, right? We're not going to say this job to be done or this need is only relevant to this one persona. I want to know, as a senior business person, how important this need is across all of our customers. Okay, so it's most important to this persona or this segment, but it's actually important to lots of people. That's far more useful to me than creating buckets of humans. So the personas help bring these people to life, but I want to size that overall need that I have used to describe this persona but could be relevant to other personas as well.
Fantastic. So with those personas at Spotify, are you able to sort of speak to how that was then used in the business to perhaps innovate or change their services?
Wish that I could tell you that. I can tell you that I have spoken to my former clients over there, and they've told me, they've given me some peeks into things that you see in the Spotify experience that changed over years, where they were like, well, that came directly from that research. But I can't go into any detail on that unless they blogged about it. I don't think they did, but go check out the blogs and the podcast. Perhaps they shared some things that I don't remember, but I don't think they shared publicly.
Fantastic.
But you look at some product changes
Sure.
in Spotify, after the 2018 timeframe, there were some things that were, you could definitely draw dotted lines that they were better understanding different types of users, customers than they had before, and better meeting their needs.
Right. So great to see that whole, I suppose, the whole life cycle, of the development, the appreciation and, I suppose, refinement from working with the other departments through to actually it's been translated into some real world change. Powerful stuff.
Yeah, it's exciting. I've learned, this is something else I learned in my 5 years at Meta. Your work can have influence that you're not even aware of. So asking the question, so staying in touch with your clients and going back a year, 2 years, 3 years later and saying, hey, how did that work help you guys? What could we have done differently or better to make it even more high impact for your team? And even in my time at Meta, I would have teams that I was working with, but the way that you used to get a promotion to a very senior level at Meta was to have impact across all of Meta. I mean, talk about a tall order. How do you have impact across, Facebook, Reality Labs, Instagram, WhatsApp, their business offerings, and so forth? But that's what you had to do in order to get promoted to a very senior research level. But those are not necessarily teams that you're working directly with. So I learned you got to go ask for it. You got to I would do these insight summits where I was trying to share insights with other researchers that we thought were relevant across all of Meta. And people would comment, oh, this is so helpful. Thank you so much. And so months later, I reach out like, poke. You said that was really helpful. How was that helpful to you? I know nothing about you. You and I do not know each other. But by the way, if you help me understand this was high impact for you, you're going to help me get a promotion. So could you please tell me about how that was helpful to you? And lo and behold, there was impact for my work. I had no idea. I would never have found out if I hadn't gone and asked that. And so as a vendor, always great to go ask your clients. But if you're in the same thing, if you're on a tiny team, maybe you're a little bitty startup and you're the only researcher, chances are you're going to know. But if you're in a big company, you may not really realize the degree to which people are using your research insights, including if you're early career, you may not realize that leadership is finding your insights helpful, and just go ask.
Brilliant. I'd just like to perhaps come back to when you decided, and there was a bit of an aha moment, I believe, where you decided you're going to change from sort of more quantitative focus into qualitative work. So what was that, and what made you sort of change that lens, I suppose? And also, if you can expand on, from your point of view, what is being truly human-centered in UX research?
Oh, boy, that's a good question. I don't really know what caused that change. It was interesting. I was consulting when I had my first child, and I expected to go right back to work. And then when she was born, I was holding this precious little child in my arms and crying and saying, I can't leave her with a nanny. My husband at the time was like, okay, well then why don't you stay home with the baby? And I was like, really? I love my work. And I guess it's a big part of my identity. So it was a real shock to everyone who knew me and for myself that I decided to take time off. I ended up taking 5 years off. And one of my former bosses came knocking on my door. He was like, we really, really need you. And I was like, well, I'm home with the kids, but they're kind of driving me crazy. It's, the hardest job ever, staying home with little kids. And so I said, I wouldn't mind working part-time. And he was like, okay, we've got work for you immediately. And I was like, but I don't want to do quant anymore. And he was like, what? You don't want to do quant anymore? I was like, I don't know, but I don't want to do quantitative research anymore. And they found that shocking, and they supported me. They were like, here's a huge body of work. You can manage all of this. And they really helped me get my career back, which I'm incredibly grateful for. I'm actually working on an activity right now where I'm writing thank you notes to people who've been pivotal for me in my career, and realizing that I need to write a thank you note to Bill McElroy and just say thank you for helping me come back to work after my 5 years off staying home with my kids. Human-centered, boy, that is a really good question. I think all of us have seen examples where our clients, our internal partners are referencing their own experiences, over-indexing on their own experiences in choosing what to do. And so often innovation comes from that. Look at Airbnb, look at Lyft and Uber. Where does that come from? That came from a person having a pain point. I need a hotel room in San Francisco and I cannot find one because it's a huge conference in San Francisco, or I can't get a taxi. It used to be a disaster to try to get a taxi in San Francisco. Who owned a car? No one. Public transportation was terrible and it closed early. So if you were out at a party late at night, you have to call a taxi and wait for an hour and it may never show up. It was awful. It was really difficult to get around the city. Well, boom, Lyft and Uber show up and they're solving a real need. But I've seen so many examples, and I think all of us can cite examples like this where it's like, why on earth are we prioritizing this? Why are we going that direction? That doesn't make sense. That's this leader who has the ability to put the stake in the ground, indexing on their own experience or some random dinner party conversation they had with their cousin, and they've over-indexed on that and they're making a decision what direction they're going to go.
Sure.
And so to me, human-centered is just really trying to understand the diversity of people who are using our products or considering using our products, using our competitive products, and recognizing there's a whole lot of diversity. There's a whole lot of drivers, likes and dislikes, and recognizing that we are just one of those data points.
Yeah, absolutely.
I like to think about the magic of the research van. And what I mean by that is I took a team of people at Meta to Tokyo to understand the virtual reality experience. And some of the highest impact experiences that we had were a giant van with a driver and the translator and the research team and the product managers and the designers all in this huge van together. And the conversations that we would have as we debriefed interviews on our way to the next interview were like, because senior leaders, these product managers, are nose to the grindstone, working, shipping, executing. And for them to immerse themselves in a different culture and real users, again, not referencing my own experience, but referencing the experience of these very diverse people who don't have MBAs from Harvard, right? Different than me, don't live in Silicon Valley. It's so incredibly helpful for opening eyes. So helpful, in fact, that we used to joke that we needed to just buy an RV and just drive it around the parking lot at Meta. Just put the senior leaders and the product managers or the designers in there and just drive around in circles so that they're focused and having conversations like, can you believe what we just heard from that participant? It's so different than just sitting in a conference room and watching a webcam interview. When you could really go out, do in-homes, do contextual, shop along, whatever, and then together move to the next interview, eat your meals together, go back to the hotel and debrief together. The magic that happens from that type of immersion, there's nothing like it. I really miss that as so much research has shifted to webcam interviews. And I'm not slamming webcam interviews. I actually personally feel like it's great for democratization because we're now able to talk to people in rural areas. We're not only interviewing people in big cities. So I really like that aspect of webcam interviews. There's a lot that I like about them, but there's nothing like the immersion of a research trip together.
Absolutely. And I think the more you can immerse yourself and experience the real world context for those particular people, I think it's just so much value in that. And I think it actually speaks to, what you're saying before around making your work visible and accessible to all stakeholders. The more they can immerse themselves in the data, it kind of helps bring some of that experience side of things and a heck of a lot more rich than just a PowerPoint or something like that, right?
So much richer than just a PowerPoint.
Julie, maybe now we could have a bit of a chat around. I'm really interested in, for a number of reasons, but primarily just around how we can enable organizations to make this more of their culture, which, I appreciate on a piece of work around bringing people on that journey. How do we sort of, I suppose, talk into that marathon of enabling organizations to build more of this capability and way of working?
Boy, that is such a good question. I teach a course on journey mapping. I teach a course on journey mapping through this online platform called Maven. So individuals can sign up for my courses. I also teach individual companies who will bring me in and we'll do a custom day-long workshop. Sometimes we're actually creating a journey map together, an assumptive journey map. Sometimes I'm just teaching them my best practices for journey mapping. And one of those best practices for journey mapping is around building buy-in for journey mapping. And this applies to any foundational research, personas, jobs to be done, whatever. How do you build buy-in for that? And I had a woman recently, I guess she was actually in a webinar that I did, not one of my courses, but she said, Julie, I've been trying to do journey mapping. It's her first job, post-grad school. She's working for one of the big tech companies in Silicon Valley, household name. And she said, I was trying to do journey mapping and they just weren't into it. And I said, time out. If they're not into it, this isn't the right moment to do it. Like, there's a tension with researchers wanting to have that portfolio piece as opposed to doing the right research at the right time for the right audience objectives and so forth.
Right.
And so what I encourage people is to begin building buy-in for something like personas and journey maps. You can do that by doing a small taste. So maybe you're doing usability study and you're able to include a very simple journey map where you show, these are the steps the person goes through in accomplishing this task, using this feature, whatever. Here's a summary, one-page summary. Here's the steps they go through. Here's what's working. Here's what's not working. Here are the opportunities. That's a very simple journey map, right? And if people buy into that, you say, we can do more of this. If this is helpful to think about it in this way, steps, biggest opportunity each step, we can do more of this. This is called a journey map, right? So you start building buy-in. Maybe you start going to, you've got your regular stand-ups with your product managers, your designers, your leadership, and you say, hey, I heard about a case study where a journey map actually helped boost, 132% increase in customer support satisfaction. Given that our strategy this year is to boost retention, reduce customer support, whatever the KPI, whatever the strategy is, I think one way we could do that is a journey map. And here's why I think that would work. Find out, is there interest in that? And if the answer is like, I don't think we have time for that. I don't think we have budget for that. We need to do a bunch of usability testing this year. We don't, doesn't make sense. Then you keep building buy-in, but you don't necessarily go do it just because you want the portfolio piece. So it's not always the right moment to do a journey map or a set of personas or a set of jobs to be done. You need to build the appetite before you just, go do this work.
Absolutely. Yeah. I love that. And, I think I've learned from those mistakes of thinking from a practitioner's point of view, oh, hey, we could do this. We could create these wonderful, really deep assets for a company, and it's just too overwhelming. So, starting where they're at and finding what I think that the key word is useful, like you said, or what's going to be helpful for this organization and what connects with them, their way of thinking, and then build off that, right?
I feel like we're at a crossroads in this industry, and I think historically we have been far too smitten with our methodologies, right? And so we want to begin research share outs with, here's the problem space, here were the objectives, here's what we did. And we go into great detail on this number of interviews, this number of respondents, we use this methodology, yada, 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 yada. The people who need those insights generally don't care about that. Researchers, we care about that. We want to know that our research is solid. But as long as people trust us, what they need us to tell them is what the results are and what it means for the decisions they're trying to make, what it means for the product, the design that they're working on. And I think we need to learn the lesson as researchers of dial that down, zip your lips. You know that you've done solid research. Your manager, your colleagues know that you're doing solid research. You've chosen the right methodology. You've executed it well. But senior leadership doesn't need to hear that, right? I'm not saying take it out of the report, but don't lead with it, right? Yeah. And I think there's just an instinct right now to be too navel-gazing about our research. And wouldn't it be an amazing world if more researchers had MBAs, if more researchers were focused more on the business and product impacts of what we're doing, as opposed to on the methodological research nerd stuff. And I'm a research nerd.
Yeah,
I'm not throwing shade at other nerds. I'm a nerd. I just want us to be more sensitive to what people need us for. And it's to unlock their ability to make well-informed decisions.
Yeah, love that framing. Maybe we can talk a little bit about that word that you use, crossroads, and in relation to what perhaps you see as the influence. I know it's pretty tough, but the influence or how the landscape is changing with AI in regards to user research.
Boy, well, that's the big question, right? And something I'm exploring myself. I'm trying to get my hands on as much AI as I can, to unlock my own research superpowers. I'm limited in what I can experiment with because as a vendor, I don't put my clients' data in tools that they have not approved. I would never take on that liability of a data breach. I'm not going to just stick this stuff in ChatGPT and see what happens. But in the journey mapping course that I teach, we practice journey mapping. So I teach people how to do qualitative interviews to arrive at a journey map, how to do the analysis, how to figure out what the phases are, how to start mapping a journey. And I needed a common experience that every single one of my students shares that we could interview each other about. So people break off into teams of 2 and they all interview each other on how did you end up in Julie's course on journey mapping on Maven? And I mean, it could have been, how do you buy shoes? How do you make a grilled cheese? It could have been anything, right? But I chose, how did you relate in my course? Because then I get insights that are helpful for me sometimes. And that's fake. I mean, it's real data, but it's not sensitive in any way. So I took, people had done their interviews and we were sorting the stickies in Mural. And I exported all of those to a CSV file and I threw them all in ChatGPT. And it did a great job finding the phases. I couldn't believe it. Because students who are new to journey mapping often really struggle with, well, what are the phases here and what should I call this phase? I could not believe how well ChatGPT did at that. There's a researcher named Kyle Soucy. I think her last name is Soucy, might be Soucey. She just posted in the last week on LinkedIn that she's been using, I think it was ChatGPT, it might have been Claude, she could have tried both, for the creation of journey maps. And I'm really excited to go try that. And again, that would be the first pass. I'm not saying that we're going to use AI to do our analysis or to do our journey mapping, but could it help make us faster researchers?
Yeah.
Maybe.
Yeah.
And could it take away some of that tedious, heavy lifting that you got to do? But if you can help me take some of the grunt work off my plate,
Sure.
I mean, it's just like transcription,
Yeah.
right? I mean, I come from a day when we used to transcribe our own interviews, and now those automatic transcripts are pretty darn good. So I'm incredibly grateful that AI-based transcripts has sped up my process so much. AI-based video editing is incredible and has made it possible for me to give great video highlights to my clients much faster than I used to be able to do. So I'm pretty bullish on AI as a way to speed up our work. Also, won't it be amazing when someday we have an AI solution that doesn't look just at the words, but also can look at the facial expressions? And maybe it's smarter than I am at decoding facial expressions and body language. What does it mean when a person looks to the right corner, to the left corner, back to the right corner, and then answers your question?
Yeah.
So when you're looking only at transcripts, you miss incredibly important nonverbal communication. You may not be able to detect from the transcript confusion. And back to my example earlier of the woman in Palo Alto with the Porsche and the Harleys and the trips to Europe, who's making ends meet by cutting coupons, I would have probably missed that if I hadn't done those interviews in person in her home. If it was just a webcam, that incredibly important context would have been missing. And that incredibly important context, I mean, maybe you could see it in the transcript. She took me into her garage and she showed me her Porsche and her Harleys, but she was super proud of them, excited about them. Yeah, there's so much that we miss if we only focus on the word people say and not the tone and the energy and the body language and the pauses. And from what I know, and maybe I'm wrong, I don't think there's an AI solution that can help researchers with that yet. Maybe it's coming.
Yeah. Maybe it is, but yeah, I'm very much aligned with you on that. What I'm keen to maybe sort of explore a wee bit now, Julie, is, because you've worked with some massive organizations along the way, and how perhaps like somebody who's a startup founder, how they can, they got limited budget, but perhaps how they could sort of engage in this type of work to really inform whatever product or service solution that they're sort of looking at. What's some sort of nimble ways that you've found?
That's interesting. Democratization of research is such a hot topic right now, and it's not something that I have much experience with, really. It's not something that we did at Meta. Research was handled by researchers, and my clients don't come to me when they're looking for do-it-yourself research. They come to me when they're like, we need senior experienced researcher that can talk to the C-suite and is solid in these foundational research frameworks like jobs to be done, journey mapping, personas. So it's not something I feel like I have a great lens into. One of my colleagues is Teresa Torres, who wrote a book, I think it's a book called Continuous Product Discovery. And she encourages product managers, designers, founders to go out and talk to customers. I have actually coached people in like startup weekends where they are brainstorming a potential solution and they start, prototyping and so forth. I've coached them on how to go do some research. Some research is better than no research. Again, let's not be self-referential. Let's not solve this just for ourselves, right? I mean, I may think it's a really great idea to have grape flavored cream cheese, but does the rest of the market think that, grape flavored cream cheese is something that sounds delicious as they want? Like, let's go find out. Let's not take this risk, this expensive risk, without having some data points. And so BOMAS book, and I'm forgetting what it's called. I'm sure I have it on my shelf.
Userpalooza.
Userpalooza, right. The beautiful yellow book. There it is. Userpalooza is a really great book for teaching people how to do good enough research. It's not going to teach you how to create a set of personas or a journey map or jobs to be done, but it's going to give you an understanding of how you can listen, how you can ask follow-up questions without leading your participant. I would encourage people to go read that, or frankly, bring in a researcher if you can afford it. Not everybody can. If you can't afford it, it's better to do some research than none. But the most important thing, I think, you just see these mistakes all the time with people who are not experienced researchers, is instead of listening, they're guiding. And they're guiding people. They tend to ask very pointed question about the solution they're most interested in, instead of trying to understand people's underlying needs and how that solution may solve them or not. And so often they'll ask questions like, well, what would you want? What would you want us to do? No, people are not product designers. People cannot solve their own problems. People can help you understand their problems, but they're not very good at solving them themselves. And that's a mistake I see with people trying to do their own research.
Love that. Yeah. And certainly something I've seen sort of helping with startups. It is a challenge, because they're there to, because they have an idea about how to solve something, and you got to have a lot of passion. And so they're very focused on this. So anything that can sort of help just to perhaps give them another lens, sort of get them out of their own head into that customer's experience or worldview, then I think that's really important to do. Maybe then just thinking about, you work in in big organizations and such. If somebody's just starting out in this type of work or interested in getting into it, what's sort of one or two or three sort of tips that you might sort of give them about how to sort of go about this, getting into this sector or this type of work?
It's so interesting. People come to me with that question all the time, and I actually don't feel like I'm very good at answering that question, because I've been in the field of user research since the field was basically created. I was working in the dot-com boom for one of the very first customer experience research and strategy firms in New York City, Creative Good. And so when people come to me and ask for advice, early career advice, I just go ask somebody else, because I'm such a dinosaur. I mean, I shouldn't call myself a dinosaur, but I've been in this field for so long, I feel like I don't understand anymore. I don't know. It's been so long since I was an early career researcher, and it was such a different market then. Yeah. And I think it's a very difficult time for people to get into this field. There are so few open roles right now for very experienced researchers, and there's so few roles right now for early career researchers. It's the people in the middle who are finding jobs. But this is a very hard moment, I think, for people getting into this field.
So what is it that you truly love about it? And what's that vision of the future for this type of work from your eyes?
Gosh, vision of the future. I mean, I really hope we get back to the point where companies are investing in UX research, because it seems like there's been a contraction. Someone just told me yesterday that, and I didn't get this woman's name, but apparently a woman did an analysis where end of 2023, could have been 2022, job postings for UX researchers were down 89%. I saw another person today, actually, I think he's a guy at Google. He's like a coach for UX researchers. And he said there were 600 job postings this month. I'm not sure what the time frame was, but maybe things are starting to turn around. Where is it going? I really hope that we as UX researchers will be more skilled in focusing on product impact and less on our navel-gazing research methodology nerd life, right? So really understand what are the decisions our research can help unlock for our partners, whoever they are, our clients, senior leaders, product managers, designers, whoever needs these insights. What is it they're really grappling with? And let me help them solve that, ideally through triangulation of research methodologies. But I'm hopeful that we will, as an industry, do a better job telling the story of how research helped unlock important decisions. I don't feel like that's a story that often gets told. And you asked me earlier, Julie, what was the product impact of the work that you did at Spotify? And I said, I can't tell you. So often we can't talk about this stuff, right? Even if we're interviewing for jobs, you're going in front of one of these FANG or MANG companies and you have to do this panel interview where you share case studies. What can you really say in accordance with the non-disclosure agreements that you signed? You have to be really careful what story you tell about the research impact that you had. And yet our inability to talk about that research impact, I think, is hurting our industry.
Yeah,
so
super
we can
insightful.
find case studies that we're able to talk about publicly. Boy, wouldn't that be powerful for all of us?
Totally agree. I think there's not enough said about the power of this, because I think that would also help people to obviously sort of realize the value of research, because often, even in organizations that I've worked with, it's always all about how do we solve this problem as opposed to how do we learn more. Jumping to solution mode as opposed to exploring and as I say, sort of learning and what are core insights in order to inform whatever solutions, taking time out of business as usual and investing their resources in that space hasn't been an easy conversation in general, I would say, that I've found. But so I'd certainly welcome a whole lot better storytelling around research, and maybe that's something I need to do as well.
Yeah, maybe that's the advice to all of us these days is, can we work with our senior leaders to say, hey, I'd like to tell this case study at a conference. Would it be okay if I shared as a case study what we did and the impact that it had on the product, and start generating more and more of these? And, I can't think of a time I've ever been able to share product impact in any tangible, meaningful way, because whether I was in-house at Meta or as a vendor, my lips are sealed.
Yeah. Julie, maybe just as we sort of finish up, I'd be really keen to sort of hear a little bit, if you have any sort of words of wisdom or advice for organizations themselves about how they could perhaps better approach UX research. So what would that be if you were sort of advising them about approaching UX and adopting it in better ways?
Yeah, I think so often clients and our colleagues come to us and say, we need focus groups. We need a journey map. We need usability testing. And these are words that they've learned. And to them, this means research, but they're not actually prescribing a methodology for us, right? And so they'll say funny things like, we need qualitative surveys. What? What do you mean by qualitative surveys? And so when a person comes to you and asks you for that kind of thing, the first thing to ask is, what is it you're trying to learn, right? And so I think if we can teach our partners to say, here's what I'm trying to learn, how can you help me? Instead of coming to us and saying, we need fill in the blank methodology. Yep. And for all of us to just continually build that muscle. I like to joke in journey mapping. If somebody comes to you and says, hey, we need a journey map, they might as well have said, hey, we need a document. Like, great. I make documents all day long. What kind of document do you want? You could have an email that we could print. You could have an Excel sheet. You could have a PowerPoint. You could have Google Slides. You have a journey map. Like, what do you want? Because what does it need to accomplish for you? Why is it you're asking me for a journey map? Who is it for? How are we going to use it? When does it need to land? What decisions is this going to support? That dictates very different types of journey maps, right? There's so much variety in journey maps, all determined by who is it for and what are we doing this for? And so anytime a product partner comes to you and says, we need fill in the blank methodology, the first question needs to be, what are you trying to learn? And I think, I learned through a mistake that I made or something I wish I'd done differently. I came into a new team at Meta that was about to ship a product. And that product was built on, I was the first researcher on this team. That product was built on some assumptions. And I was ramping up to this enterprise space and just trying to get my head around it. Like, it was a very steep learning curve. And what I didn't ask, and I wish I had asked, was, what are the assumptions that you made when you decided to build this product? They were not asking me to do that kind of foundational research. Are we building the right thing? They were asking me to help them execute shipping this product. But what became clear fairly immediately was there were some assumptions that were made in choosing what we were going to build that were actually flawed. And so had I had more visibility to that earlier in the process, it would have helped me realize I need to also be exploring this as I'm helping them ship this other thing. So anytime an organization, a leader can come in and say, we're struggling with this decision. Should we ship this or should we ship that? Should this be our strategy or should that be our strategy? The sooner they reveal those kinds of decisions they're trying to make, the better prepared you are as a researcher to figure out what kind of research you can be doing to support those decisions. And our organizations and our leaders need to understand research takes time. And so they need to bring those things they're grappling with to our attention as early as possible so that we have time to then go execute. Because there's nothing worse than finding out, late stage, this is what you actually care about. My survey is already in the field.
Yeah.
And you didn't tell me this earlier. And that's partially on us. That's on helping our internal partners understand. I need to understand your landscape and what it is you're trying to achieve, what your goals are. And by understanding that, by you making time for me to understand that, by you including me in the right meetings, having a seat at the table, I'm going to be in a much better position to support you.
Love it. I mean, I think that's so insightful. And I think the key word, what is it you're trying to, or key sentence, what are you trying to learn, needs to sort of stay prominent all the time. So look, Julie, I really appreciate you making this time. I've learned so much. It's been super invaluable, and appreciate you sort of giving your expertise to our audience. Thank you very much.
And thank you. It's been really great to chat, Vaughn. I appreciate it.
Been a pleasure. Now, before we sort of finish off, how is it best for our audience to get hold of you, Julie?
Great question. So you can find me on LinkedIn. So Julie Francis, BellaVia Research. There's a lot of Julie Francises out there. So Julie Francis, BellaVia Research. People always ask me, what is that BellaVia? It's actually a combination of my kids' names. So Bella
Lovely.
and Simone Olivia combines to form BellaVia Research. You could also probably search Julie Francis Meta and find me that way. So LinkedIn is a great way to find me. And there I do write articles about journey mapping. I've been trying to get myself to write more articles about personas, but personas seem to have kind of fallen out of favor. So I don't write about them nearly as much as I write about journey mapping. And if you wanted to learn more about journey mapping, you can search for my courses on 2 different platforms. I have a very short pre-recorded lecture version on Udemy Academy. And again, you would just search best practices for journey mapping on Udemy, and also on the Maven platform. So same course name, best practices for journey mapping. The Maven, though, is a live cohort-based course. So that's a week-long workshop. There's 12 hours of live instruction, hands-on activities, Q&A that takes place over the course of a week. But if you go to Maven and sign up to be notified when I announce courses, you can actually get a little freebie. Do I have one here on my desk? I do not. It's like a poster that summarizes all the principles for journey maps with impact and some associated best practices, things you can do to maximize the impact of your journey maps.
Thank you very much for
Of course.
that opportunity for the audience. So again, Julie, thanks very much, and look forward to catching you in the future.
Great. Thank you so much, Vaughn.
Bye for now.
Bye.